If you've ever felt live music land in your chest, a voice carrying clean across a field of 100,000 people, you've felt what Charlie Watkins made. His company, WEM, built the first true wall of sound, and the little echo box behind the sound of British rock. It was never large, 40 people in a small factory off the Oval. But by the end of the 60s, scarcely a great British band played a festival without WEM behind them. The Stones, The Who, Pink Floyd and Hendrix on the Isle of Wight. It survived being dragged into court for sheer loudness, its founder hauled off the mixing desk by the police mid-gig. It survived every rival who tried to copy its machines and never quite caught the magic. And then, after 30 years, the loudest name in British music simply went quiet. How does a company at the top of its world just stop? And how does the man who built it vanish from the story? Chapter 1. The Loudest Silence on the Island. The last week of August 1970. A hillside on the Isle of Wight, and somewhere between 600,000 and 700,000 people have come to sit on it. That is the Guinness estimate, and it makes this, for a few days, one of the largest gatherings of human beings in the history of the British Isles. More than Woodstock. More than anyone had planned for, or fenced for, or fed. A city the size of Glasgow assembled on farmland, facing a single wooden stage, and every watt of sound coming off that stage belonged to a balding, middle-aged man from Balham who did not much care for rock and roll. His name was Charlie Watkins. He was 47 years old. He had spent the war in the Merchant Navy and the years since selling accordions and guitars from a cramped shop in South London, and on this particular night he was crouched behind a mixing desk with the needles buried in the red, trying to push something close to 5,000 watts of power into the largest open-air audience Britain had ever produced. It was, at the time, the biggest sound system in the world. He had built it himself in a small factory off the Kennington Road, with a staff you could count on your fingers and toes. On the third night, Jimi Hendrix walked out to play. It would be his last performance in Britain. Within 3 weeks, he would be dead, in a flat in Notting Hill, 27 years old. Nobody on that hill knew it yet. What they knew was that the sound wasn't right. The wind had got up off the Solent, and it was taking Charlie's carefully stacked columns of noise and throwing them backwards over the heads of the crowd, out towards the sea. The people at the front heard music. The people at the back heard weather. Somewhere in the recordings from that night, you can catch Hendrix's voice between numbers. Not singing, just asking. "Turn it up, Charlie." He couldn't turn it up. There was nothing left to turn. The machine was already screaming. This is the strange thing about Charlie Watkins, and it is the thing this entire story turns on. He is arguably the man who invented the sound of the modern music festival, the wall of speakers, the mixing desk out front, the whole architecture of how 500,000 people can hear one guitar. The Rolling Stones used his gear. The Who used it. Pink Floyd used more of it than anyone. And yet if you stopped a stranger in the street today and said the words Watkins Electric Music, or the Copicat, or Charlie Watkins, you would almost certainly get a blank look. The events he made audible are legendary. The man who made them audible is a footnote. He never wanted it any other way, as it turns out. That is part of what makes it a tragedy, and part of what makes it not one at all. Because there is a story that gets told about Charlie Watkins, a neat, satisfying, infuriating story. It goes like this. Here was a brilliant, trusting engineer who invented the greatest echo machine on Earth and the loudest sound system in the world, and who made one catastrophic mistake. He didn't patent it properly. He left the door open. And the giants, the Americans, the Japanese, Roland above all, walked straight through it, copied his machines, built them cheaper, and stole the entire global industry he had created out from under him. One naive slip. Billions lost. An empire erased. It is a good story. It has heroes and villains and a clean moral. Almost every part of it is wrong. The truth is stranger and quieter and in some ways sadder, though not in the way the legend wants. Charlie Watkins did fail to patent his most famous invention. That much is true. But it was a choice, not a blunder, and it is not what brought him down. Nobody stole his empire. He gave a great deal of it away on purpose, and then, At the height of his fame, he simply decided he'd had enough, paid off his staff, sold the factory, and went back to the accordion. To understand how a man walks away from the sound of the modern world, you have to go back to a mess room on a merchant ship in the middle of the Atlantic, where a 15-year-old boy first heard an instrument that would define his life. Not a guitar, not an amplifier, an accordion. Chapter 2. An Accordion in the Atlantic. Charlie Watkins was born in London on the 28th of June, 1923. The East End, by most accounts, though even this, the record leaves slightly blurred. What isn't blurred is what kind of childhood it was. Working class, between the wars, in a city still full of horses and coal smoke. The sort of upbringing where you left school early and went to find a wage, because the wage was the point. He went to sea. In 1938, aged 15, he joined the Merchant Navy, the civilian fleet that carried Britain's food, fuel and cargo across the oceans. A year later, the war began, and the Merchant Navy became one of the most dangerous jobs a young man could hold. These were unarmed ships, slow and heavy, running the gauntlet of the North Atlantic convoys while German U-boats hunted them in packs. The statistics are almost impossible to sit with. Across the war, roughly 1 in 4 Merchant Navy crews did not come home. A teenager on those decks had worse odds than a soldier, and it was there, on a ship, in the mess room, that Charlie Watkins fell in love. Not with the sea, with a steward who played the accordion to pass the long hours between watches. The sound of it, warm, portable, human, filling a metal room in the middle of a black ocean, got into the boy and never left. He begged to be taught. He learned. On convoys, where 3 of every 4 crews were being lost, a South London teenager found the instrument he would come back to at the very end of his life, decades later, when the empire was gone and the festivals were over, and he wanted, more than anything, to be left in peace with a squeeze box. That is where a rock and roll story begins. In a war, on the water, with the least rock and roll instrument imaginable. He survived. Millions didn't, but Charlie did. And he came home to a grey, rationed, exhausted Britain and did the only thing he knew he loved. He played. Through the late 1940s, he made his living as a professional accordionist, working the clubs and functions of post-war London. But a working musician learns quickly that the money is thin and the nights are long, and Charlie had a practical, restless, tinkering sort of mind. In 1949, with his brother Reg, he opened a record shop in Tooting Market. Reg matters here, and so does a third brother, Sid, or Sid, depending on which document you trust. This was a family enterprise from the first day, 3 brothers from South London with more nerve than capital. The record shop did well enough that in 1951 they took bigger premises up the road, at 26 Balham High Road, and began selling not just records but instruments, accordions naturally, and guitars, though in that Britain, in the very early 50s, the general public didn't even have the word yet. They came into the shop and asked to see the banjos. A guitar was still an exotic thing, an American thing, a thing you'd seen in a film, which points at the great frustration of the age and the great opportunity hiding inside it. Post-war currency restrictions made it almost impossible to import American equipment. The good amplifiers, the good gear, it was over there, behind a wall of trade rules, and a shopkeeper in Balham simply could not get it. So the guitars hung from the ceiling of Charlie's little shop and marched up the wall of the staircase, and there was nothing decent to plug them into. Charlie decided he would just build the amplifiers himself. He had no formal training in electronics. What he had was the tinkerer's confidence, a backroom that smelled of hot valves and solder, and, by his own cheerful admission, a Black & Decker drill that constituted the entire manufacturing capacity of the operation. That was the factory. 1 man, 1 drill, 1 workbench behind a shop that sold squeeze boxes and banjos. And then, in 1957, the ground moved under British music. A man called Lonnie Donegan had a hit, and skiffle arrived. Cheap, fast, do-it-yourself music that any lad with a guitar, a washboard and a tea-chest bass could play in his front room. Suddenly, every teenager in Britain wanted a guitar, and every guitar wanted an amplifier. The demand that had been a trickle became a flood, and it broke over the exact spot where Charlie Watkins happened to be standing, with a drill in his hand and a head full of half-taught electronics. He was ready. Or ready enough, because he had already started building. Chapter 3. The Box That Purred. The first amplifiers Charlie built, around 1952, nearly ended the whole story before it began. They ran on a design that could deliver a genuine electric shock through the guitar, and when Charlie read in the paper of a musician somewhere being electrocuted, he did something that tells you a great deal about the man. He recalled them, quietly pulled them back in, at his own cost, because the alternative was a risk to the people who trusted him. It was not a businessman's instinct, it was a decent man's instinct. Remember it, because it recurs. By 1954, with the skiffle boom gathering, he built the Westminster, a proper little amplifier, made with a collaborator named Arthur O'Brien, aimed squarely at the flood of new players. And by the end of the decade, he had the Dominator, a valve amplifier of around 17 watts, its front angled into a distinctive V shape so that the sound projected up and out towards the player and the room. That V-front would become a Watkins signature. Hold on to the Dominator, too. It will come back to haunt this story in the most ironic way imaginable. But the machine that made Charlie Watkins's name was not an amplifier. It was a box that made echo. The idea came, as the best ideas often do, from somewhere completely unrelated. Charlie heard the records of an Italian bandleader, Marino Marini, songs like Com Prima and Volare, and there was a lush, repeating slapback echo on them that fascinated him. He found out how it was done. 2 Revox tape machines, wired together, one recording and one playing back a fraction of a second later, the delay creating that ghostly doubling. It was expensive, cumbersome, studio-bound. Charlie's genius was to ask a simple question. What if you could put that in a box, cheap enough and small enough for any working band to carry to a gig? He handed the problem to an engineer named Bill Purkis, and Purkis cracked it in 3 months. What they built in 1958 was a thing of real beauty and real cunning, a valve unit about 12 inches by 8, holding a single loop of tape running past 3 replay heads, with a feedback loop that let the echoes repeat and decay. 2 ECC83 valves and a 6 BR8, a turquoise and cream case that looked like something off the deck of an ocean liner. They called it the Copicat because it copied the sound and threw it back at you. The first 100 sold out in a single Saturday. That is not a figure of speech. Charlie's shop shifted the entire first production run of 100 Copicats on the first day they were offered. The queue ran down Balham High Road, and, this is the detail that survives, passers-by assumed it was for the cut-price greengrocers, because who queues down a suburban high street for an echo machine? The very first one out of the door went to Johnny Kidd, whose guitarist would use it on a record called Shakin' All Over, a British #1 in 1960, and one of the founding documents of the entire British rock sound. The guitar on it, depending on which telling you believe, was Joe Moretti's, or later Mick Green's. Either way, the twang and the slap of the early British rock records were coming, more and more, out of Charlie's little turquoise box. Within a couple of years, WEM was selling something in the region of 1,000 Copicats a month. Now, here is the part the legend gets hold of and never lets go. Everybody wanted to copy the Copicat. Rivals across Europe, Miazzi, Binson and others, built their own tape echoes, and later the giants would too, and they all found, to their endless frustration, that they couldn't quite catch it. Their machines were technically fine. Some were arguably better on paper, but they didn't have the sound. Charlie knew exactly why, and he took a certain wicked pleasure in never telling anyone. The magic of the Copicat, he confessed years later, came from what he called a bit of bad engineering, a quirk, an imperfection, an accidental flaw in the original design that gave it its particular character. He wouldn't say what it was, and so the competitors kept doing the reasonable thing, the sensible thing, the thing any good engineer would do. They kept improving it, cleaning it up, refining it, and in refining away the flaw, they refined away the very thing that made it worth having. They engineered the soul out of it, chasing perfection, while Charlie sat in Balham selling 1,000 a month of a machine whose secret was that it wasn't quite right. He did not patent this. That fact will loom enormous by the end of this film. For now, hold 2 things in your mind at once. He didn't patent the Copicat, and it sold hundreds of thousands of units and stayed in production, in one form or another, for over 50 years. The story you've been told says the missing patent destroyed him. The Copicat says otherwise. It says the missing patent may have been the smartest thing he never did. Chapter 4. One of the Big Three. By the start of the 1960s, the little shop had become a proper firm. In 1961, Charlie bought a factory off Offley Road near the Oval and staffed it, at its very peak, with something like 40 people. 40. Keep that number because it is the whole truth about the scale of Watkins Electric music, and it sits in almost comic contrast to the size of the sound the firm would go on to make. This was never a sprawling industrial giant with 10,000 on the books and its own railway sidings. It was one factory, one family, and 40 pairs of hands. And with those 40 pairs of hands, WEM became one of the big three of the entire British musical instrument trade. The competition was real and named. There was Vox, run by Tom Jennings, whose gear the Beatles would make world famous and whose stylish logo Charlie admired so much that he shortened his own brand, Watkins Electric Music, to the snappier WEM in imitation of it, around 1963 into 1964. There was Selmer. And rising behind them all, a drum shop owner in West London named Jim Marshall, about to build the loudest name in the history of the electric guitar. Remember the Dominator, Charlie's little V-fronted 17-watt amplifier from the late 50s? Here is where the whole legend of Charlie Watkins, the trusting engineer robbed blind by copycats, quietly turns inside out. Jim Marshall's celebrated 18-watt amplifier, a design cherished to this day, cloned and reissued and worshipped by guitarists the world over, is, when you put the two circuits side by side, very nearly a copy of the Watkins Dominator. The historian Dave Hunter examined both and found them almost identical, right down to an unusual quirk of the layout. The tone control placed before the volume control, an odd arrangement that both amps share. Marshall and his engineers, the account goes, based their circuit on Charlie's. Sit with the shape of that for a moment, because it is the exact opposite of the story we started with. In the amplifier world, the copying didn't run away from Charlie Watkins. It ran towards him. The most famous amplifier company Britain ever produced borrowed one of its foundational designs from the Accordion man in Balham. And it was Marshall, not Watkins, who went on to conquer the world with it. Meanwhile, the family kept building. Reg and Sid set up a guitar operation in Chertsey and produced the Rapier, which has a decent claim to being the second British solid-body electric guitar ever made, pipped to first place by a rival, the Dallas Tuxedo, by about a week. A week. That was the margin between a footnote and a place in the history books, and WEM landed on the wrong side of it by 7 days. The firm was full of characters who kept the whole thing running. Sid Metherell, the works manager who gave the company 30 years. Phil Lee, the first sales agent out on the road. And it produced, in this period, exactly one product that Charlie did aggressively try to protect. A guitar organ. A guitar with organ voices built in, which he claimed to have got patented ahead of his rivals. We had a guitar organ, which I patented, he'd say. I got mine patented first. It was a commercial disaster. Look hard at that, because it is the neatest, cruelest little joke in the whole affair. The one WEM product Charlie says he actually patented flopped. The product he pointedly didn't patent, the Copicat, sold by the 100,000 and outlived the entire era. If the moral of the story were really, he should have patented everything, the guitar organ is the counterexample, sitting right there in the ledger, quietly refusing to behave. But all of this, the amps, the echo, the guitars, the big three, is prologue. Because in the mid-60s, Charlie Watkins stopped selling boxes to musicians and started doing something no one in Britain had properly done before. He started making it possible for a crowd of 500,000 people to hear a band at all. Chapter 5. A Wall of Sound. It began with a humiliation, and it began with the Byrds. In 1965, the American band The Byrds came to Britain on the wave of Mr. Tambourine Man, and Charlie's company was providing the sound. It did not go well. The public address system, the PA, simply wasn't up to it. In an era when live sound was an afterthought, when bands were routinely drowned out by their own screaming fans through a couple of feeble speakers, the gear failed the moment. David Crosby, by all accounts, was furious. Roger McGuinn, more gracious, less so. But Charlie Watkins came away from that tour with something lodged in him. the same restless instinct that had once made him build his own amplifiers, rather than accept there weren't any. If nobody had solved the problem of live sound, then he would. The breakthrough was a piece of engineering elegance called the slave amplifier. Charlie, working with an engineer named Norman Sargent, developed the WEM SL100, a power amplifier based in part on an RCA design that could be daisy-chained. One master unit feeding a whole row of slaves, each driving its own column of speakers. Suddenly, sound was no longer limited by the power of a single amplifier. You could just keep adding slaves. You could keep stacking columns. You could build, in principle, a wall. The idea was hatched in unglamorous circumstances, chewed over with his Belgian and French distributors, Albert Verriest and Alain Lemurge, who'd once paid him in a tea towel knotted full of mixed European banknotes. And to control all this power, Charlie needed a mixer, a desk to blend the sound out front. He built one, the Audiomaster, and the first prototype was a rough mock-up covered in leather cloth that the workshop affectionately named Fred. Goodman's speakers, Axiom 301s, Tannoy, Celestion, ordinary components, assembled by a man who refused to accept that a crowd couldn't be made to hear. Then came Windsor in August 1967, and everything changed. At the Windsor Jazz and Blues Festival, Charlie assembled what is generally reckoned to be the first 1,000-watt PA in the world. 10 SL100 slaves driving a wall of columns. 1,000 watts. Today your neighbour's telly can nearly manage that. In 1967, it was a physical force, a thing that pressed on your chest. Charlie later described the ambition in the only terms grand enough for it. He wanted the loudest sound heard, he said, since Hitler addressed the rallies at Nuremberg. It was a shocking comparison, and he meant it to be. He was building something without precedent. The young singer Arthur Brown stood in front of that wall and screamed his way through, "Fire!" and the sound rolled out across Windsor and did not stop at the edge of the field. It rolled into the town. It rolled into people's homes, and the authorities did the only thing authorities could do when confronted with a noise that had never legally existed before. They came for Charlie. He was, at one point, escorted from the mixing position by the police, mid-festival, hauled off like a criminal, because his sound system was simply too loud for the law to countenance. It went to court, and in one of those details, you couldn't invent, Charlie Watkins, accordionist, ex-merchant navy, Balham shopkeeper, was defended by Quintin Hogg, one of the most eminent QCs in the land, a man who would later sit in the House of Lords as Lord Hailsham, and Charlie won. The loudest sound in Britain was declared, in effect, lawful. The wall could stand. That same festival gave Fleetwood Mac their debut, and gave Charlie one more invention. This one entirely by accident. Roger Chapman, the singer with the band family, couldn't hear himself over the wall of noise, and in frustration grabbed one of the side speakers and hauled it round to point back at himself, so the sound would fold back to the stage. Charlie watched a man solve a problem in real time and understood instantly what he was looking at. The stage monitor. Fold back. The wedge-shaped speaker angled up at the performer's feet that every gig on earth now takes for granted. It was born from a singer's annoyance and an inventor's eye on a field in Windsor, and Charlie simply started building it into the system. He had, in the space of about 2 years, invented the modern live sound rig, the slave amp, the portable mixer, foldback, the wall. He gave most of it away, lent gear to bands, mixed their sound for nothing, turned up to festivals and charged no one, because he loved the engineering challenge and because it built the legend faster than any advertisement could. Every great band in Britain now wanted the WEM wall behind them, and that generosity, that refusal to treat the whole thing as a business, was about to carry Charlie Watkins to the 2 most famous fields in the history of British music, and to the strange wind-blown summit where his triumph and his disillusion would turn out to be the very same moment. Chapter 6. Edgware, 7 miles away. The peak, when it came fast. A golden run of 18 months in 1969 and 1970, when there was scarcely a defining moment in British music that Charlie Watkins had not made audible. In April 1969, Janis Joplin played the Royal Albert Hall, with the sound mixed by a WEM engineer named John Thompson. It was, by the accounts that survive, overwhelming, the American singer so moved by hearing herself carried properly to an audience that she reportedly wept with gratitude afterwards, and had the rig flown back across the Atlantic so she could use it in the States. An accordion man from Balham had built a wall of sound that made Janis Joplin cry. Then came July and Hyde Park and the Rolling Stones. The Stones' free concert in Hyde Park in the summer of 1969 drew a crowd of 250,000 people, one of the defining images of the whole era, endlessly rescreened ever since. And the sound that reached that 250,000 was Charlie's, around 1,500 watts of it, the columns partly borrowed back at short notice from Mark Bolan's T-Rex. It worked so completely that the sound reportedly carried clean out of the park and across London, heard, they said, in Edgware, 7 miles away. If you watch the old footage closely, the historian Gary Cooper once observed, you can occasionally spot a small, balding man near the stage looking entirely out of place among the rock stars. That was Charlie. Without him, Cooper wrote, that concert could not have happened at all. He was, by now, the man behind the curtain of British rock. Pink Floyd became his biggest customers of all, so committed to the WEM sound that the band arranged their columns of speakers across the back cover of their 1969 album Ummagumma, a quiet monument in vinyl to the gear that made them loud. David Bowie, in this period, was a familiar face around the operation, known to put his feet up on Charlie's desk and eat fish and chips off it while working out the songs that would make him famous. Mark Bolan thought so much of Charlie that he wrote him a book of poems. The Who ran their sound through it, with Pete Townshend and his sound man Bob Pridden pushing always for more, louder, more. Charlie had a name for what he had built. He called it, simply, My Wall of Sound. And back at the Offley Road factory, the making of that wall had a physical, almost frightening presence. The low frequencies the system could produce were so powerful that the young women who worked in the upstairs office were sometimes reduced to tears by the sheer bodily force of the bass being tested below them. On one occasion, a speaker cabinet is said to have walked itself off a shelf under its own vibration and come down on the head of the works manager, Gordon Shepherd. This was sound as a physical substance. Sound you could be injured by. And then came the Isle of Wight and the Summit and the Wind. There were 2 festivals, back to back. In 1969, Bob Dylan came out of his long seclusion to play the island, and by every account, Charlie's sound that year was superb. It was the following year, 1970, that everything converged. The 600,000-plus crowd, the largest of the age and Charlie's largest rig ever built. Something close to 5,000 watts assembled for the biggest audience of his life. It should have been the crowning glory. The definitive proof of the wall of sound. The moment the whole story had been building towards. It was, in the end, a partial defeat. The wind came in off the sea and took the sound and threw it backwards, away from the very crowd it was meant to reach, scattering Charlie's masterpiece across the water. The needles were buried in the red. There was nothing more to give. And out at the front of the stage, on the last night of his last British performance, Jimi Hendrix, 3 weeks from death, kept asking the man behind the desk for something the man could no longer provide. Turn it up, Charlie. Here is the terrible symmetry of it, and it is why this is where the golden age has to end. The single largest thing Charlie Watkins ever built is also the place where his sound failed most publicly. Defeated not by any rival, not by any patent, not by any Japanese corporation, but by the weather. His absolute peak and the beginning of his disillusion were not 2 events. They were one event, on one windswept hill, in the last week of a summer that was already ending. He was standing at the very top, and from up there, though he could not yet have put it into words, Charlie Watkins was beginning to be able to see the whole way down. Chapter 7. The Wind Changes. The wind on the Isle of Wight was not just the wind, it was the whole decade turning. Because the thing about a summit is that you can only leave it by going down, and the ground began to shift under Charlie Watkins almost the moment he reached the top. None of it arrived as a single catastrophe. That is the first thing the legend gets wrong. There was no villain at the gates, no hostile takeover, no boardroom betrayal. What there was instead was a slow gathering of pressures, external, technological, personal, each one reasonable, each one survivable, and all of them arriving at once around a man who was, when you stripped away the mythology, running a workshop of 40 people, almost entirely on his own enthusiasm. Start with the business itself, because it was changing shape. In the early days, if a band wanted a wall of sound, they came to Charlie, and Charlie sold or lent them the gear. But by the early 70s, a new kind of company had appeared, the hire firm. Bands no longer needed to own a rig. They could simply rent one for the tour and give it back. It was a sensible development, and it quietly pulled the floor out from under the WEM model. Worse, the rented rigs were often better. A firm called Kelsey and Morris built a bass speaker enclosure, a W bin, folded to project low frequencies, that outperformed anything WEM had. Charlie had invented the field. Now other people were farming it, and farming it harder. Then there was the sound itself, and what the country was beginning to think of it. The party was turning nasty. At the Bath Festival, Charlie was struck on the head by a thrown bottle and concussed. The man who built the sound, bleeding at the edge of the crowd it drew. And the loudness he had fought Quintin Hogg's case to legalise was now becoming a public anxiety. People were starting to ask whether these enormous volumes were dangerous. At Grangemouth in 1973, sound levels were measured at a constant 128 decibels, a wall of noise held for hours, and by any medical standard genuinely hazardous. This was the beginning of the great backlash against volume, the first stirrings of the noise regulations and hearing protection culture that govern live music to this day, and it landed on precisely the wrong man. Because Charlie Watkins, and this is the part that so few people understand about him, had a conscience about it. He had never done this for the noise. He had done it as an engineering problem. Now people were suggesting that his solution might be deafening a generation, and it troubled him deeply enough that he went privately to a Harley Street specialist to ask whether the thing he had built might be causing permanent harm. Sit with that image. The father of the festival PA, quietly consulting a doctor, worried that his life's work was hurting people. That is not a man being outcompeted. That is a man losing his stomach for the fight. Now, the technology. And here is where we must at last confront the great villain of the legend and gently take him apart, because his name has a face and a workshop and a story of his own. And once you know it, the whole theory collapses. The story we began with names the enemy directly, the Japanese, and Roland above all, who supposedly swooped in, reverse-engineered Charlie's Copicat, and mass-produced it with cheaper technology until his global market was gone. Picture the villain the legend needs. A faceless corporation, a stolen blueprint, a ship full of counterfeits leaving Yokohama. It is a satisfying picture. It is also entirely imaginary. Roland was founded in April 1972 by a man named Ikutaro Kakehashi, and Kakehashi was not a corporation. He was, in almost every respect that matters, the Japanese Charlie Watkins, a self-taught engineer, a tinkerer who had come up through repairing clocks and radios and building things by hand because he could not afford to buy them. And years before Roland existed, at his previous company, Ace Tone, Kakehashi had already built his own tape echo, the Ace Tone Echo Chamber, the EC1, designed from his own workbench, out of his own frustrations, in the late 1960s. When Roland released its celebrated Space Echo, the RE201, in 1974, it was not the child of Charlie's Copicat. It was the grandchild of Kakehashi's own earlier machine. His lineage, his problem solved his way. Two men, 10,000 miles apart, neither aware of the other, each looking at the same expensive studio tape delay and asking the same question. What if you could put this in a box a working band could carry? That is not theft. That is the oldest pattern in the history of invention. An idea whose time has come, arriving in a dozen workshops at once. Watkins in London, Miyazaki and Binson in Italy, Maestro in America with the Echoplex, Kakehashi in Japan. Nobody needed to open up Charlie's turquoise box and copy its secrets. They were all independently building their own. And the deeper truth is that the thing which finally overtook the Copicat was not a rival machine at all. It was a change in the physics of how echo gets made, and it would have come for Charlie no matter what he patented. First came the Bucket Brigade chip, the little solid-state device that could pass a signal along in tiny steps and produce echo with no tape, no moving parts, nothing to wear out. By the middle of the 70s, an American firm was selling one built into a pedal, the Electroharmonix Memory Man, that did in silence what the Copicat did with a whirring loop of tape and three heads that needed cleaning. And then, at the turn of the 80s, came the thing that ended the argument for good. Digital delay. By 1983, you could buy a small box that sat on the floor by your feet and produced perfect, endless, flawless echo from a chip, cleaner than tape could ever be, and cheaper, and eternal. That is what overtook the Copicat, not a Japanese conspiracy. The quiet, unstoppable arrival of a better way to make the same sound. It would have overtaken a machine with 1,000 patents, exactly as surely as one with none. The legend needed a thief. What there actually was progress, impersonal, inevitable, and nobody's fault, which leaves the last and quietest of the pressures, and the one that mattered most. It was not out in the world at all. It was inside the firm. WEM was tiny, and it was intimate, and it was, in the end, one man. The gifted engineer, Bill Purkis, who had designed the Copicat, had left back in 1963. Good managers were poached away. Charlie's own health was failing, a thyroid condition draining the very energy on which the whole enterprise ran. There was no second tier of leadership, no succession, no structure that could survive the loss of the man at its centre. He had built a wall of sound that could fill the Isle of Wight. He had never built a company that could outlive him. And so, with the hire firms rising and the technology turning and the noise laws gathering and the bottles flying and his own body slowing, Charlie Watkins sat at the top of everything he had made and began, reasonably, decision by decision, to come down. Chapter 8. The Mistakes That Weren't the Mistake. This is the chapter the whole film has been walking towards. The title promised you one fatal mistake. One naive slip that destroyed the world's greatest rock inventor. So, let us go and find it. Let us walk into the rooms where the decisions were actually made, one at a time, and see which of them was the killer. Begin with the famous one. The patent. Picture the moment it would have had to happen. Charlie in the back room at Balham, the Copicat selling 1,000 a month. Some sensible advisor surely leaning in to say, "Protect it, Charlie. Get it registered. Lock the world out." And picture him not doing it, because he understood the bargain a patent asks of you, and he did not like the terms. A patent is a trade. The state grants you protection, and in return you must publish, in complete detail, exactly how your invention works. You hand the secret to the world in exchange for a piece of paper. And the secret of the Copicat was that bit of bad engineering, the accidental flaw that gave it its magic, the very thing his rivals kept failing to reproduce, precisely because they kept sensibly correcting it. To patent the Copicat, Charlie would have had to stand up and tell every competitor on Earth the one thing that made his box worth more than theirs. So, he didn't. He kept his mouth shut and let a dozen rivals improve themselves into mediocrity. Nobody in the record dissented from this. Nobody argued he should have done otherwise because at the time it was plainly working. And the ledger settles the question for good. The unpatented Copicat sold hundreds of thousands of units and stayed in production for more than 50 years. The one product Charlie did proudly patent, the guitar organ, the guitar with the built-in organ voices, the thing he boasted he'd got registered ahead of his rivals, died on the shelf. A commercial failure. If the missing patent was the fatal mistake, then somebody forgot to tell the machine that outlived the festivals, and somebody forgot to tell the patented product that quietly flopped. That was not the blunder of a naive man. It was, arguably, the shrewdest call of his career. Cross it off the list. It wasn't the fatal decision. Now walk into the second room. 1964, and a genuine fork in the road. Amplifiers were changing. The old valves, the glowing glass bottles that gave an amp its warmth and its weight, were being challenged by the new solid-state transistors. Cheaper, lighter, quicker to build. And standing across the workbench from Charlie was Norman Sargent, his senior engineer, the man who had helped him crack the slave amplifier itself. Sargent was adamant. Valves were finished. The future was solid state, and WEM should go there now. Charlie disagreed. Charlie wanted to build a big valve amplifier. His instinct told him there was something in that sound worth keeping. But here is the pressure that shaped the moment, and it is the kind of pressure that never appears in the legend. Norman Sargent was his only senior engineer. In a firm of 40 people run on personal loyalty, you do not casually overrule the one man you cannot afford to lose. So Charlie, the founder, the inventor, the man whose name was on the door, deferred. He set aside his own instinct to keep his engineer. WEM went solid state, and in doing so, it stepped aside from the exact wave it should have caught. Because the sound about to define the next decade, the sound of heavy rock, of the 70s, of stadiums, was the roar of the overdriven valve amplifier. And the man who rode that wave to worldwide fame was Jim Marshall, building loud valve amps on a circuit that owed a great deal, as we have seen, to Charlie's own Dominator. So consider the full shape of it. Charlie Watkins wanted to build a big valve amp. He was talked out of it by his own engineer, and then he watched the valve amplifier become the single most lucrative product in the history of the instrument trade, built by the man who had borrowed his design, from the sidelines. Was that the fatal mistake? It was certainly the costliest one. It is the decision that meant WEM never became Marshall. But look closely, because it did not destroy WEM either. It simply closed a door to a fortune Charlie was never really chasing. A man is not killed by the kingdom he declines to conquer. Cross it off too. 2 rooms, 2 decisions, and the title's promised catastrophe is nowhere to be found. Which means we have to keep walking, into the decisions that were never really about business at all. Chapter 9. The Man Who Chose to Leave. There are 2 more decisions, and they are the ones the legend has no language for, because they are not mistakes in any way a spreadsheet would recognize. They are simply the shape of the man. The first was the give it away model. For years, Charlie lent his gear to bands for nothing. He mixed festivals for free. He turned up to the defining events of the age and charged no one, poured the firm's resources into building the legend rather than the balance sheet. Understand what a strange way to run a company that is. It was magnificent marketing. It made WEM the name behind British rock, the Wall behind the Stones and Hendrix, and the Floyd. And no advertisement on earth could have bought that. But it was also a business engineered to produce fame instead of capital, and it could not function for a single day without Charlie himself at the center of it, giving, lending, mixing, charming, physically present at the desk. He had built a firm perfectly designed to make everyone love it, and no one, its owner, least of all, rich. The second was the one that sealed everything, and it is the quietest of all. He never built a successor. There was no second-in-command groom to take the reins, no management tier, no structure that could carry the name WEM forward when the founder's energy finally ran out. Bill Purkis, the brilliant hand who had designed the Copicat, had walked out the door in 1963. The good managers who came after were poached away one by one, and Charlie never replaced the loss with a system, because the firm had never been a system. It had always been Charlie. It could only ever be Charlie. So now line all 4 up, in the order we found them. The unpatented Copicat, which was the right call. The solid-state amp bet, which cost him Marshall's kingdom, but not his own. The give-it-away model, which built a legend and no fortune. The absent succession, which meant the firm could not survive the man. Lay them out on the bench and look at them honestly, and you will notice the thing the title of this film desperately does not want you to notice. Not one of them destroyed Watkins Electric music, because Watkins Electric music was not, in the end, destroyed. And this is the revelation the entire story has been withholding from you. There was no killing blow. There was no fatal error. There was no single mistake, because in the end, Charlie Watkins was not defeated by any of these things at all. He looked at the hire firms and the noise laws and the flying bottles and the Harley Street warning and the failing thyroid and the digital future arriving on the floor by his feet. And in 1974, at the very height of his fame, a man who had never much liked rock and roll in the first place made the one decision the legend simply cannot hold. He decided to stop. Not because he was beaten, because he had had enough. Because the world he had made had turned loud and violent and litigious and troubling to his conscience, and because somewhere at the back of it all there was still a mess room on a merchant ship and a steward with an accordion, and that was the thing he actually wanted. So he paid off his staff. He sold the factory, and he went home. The fatal decision was never a patent he forgot to file. It was a choice to leave, and it was, from first to last, entirely his own. Chapter 10. He simply stopped. There is no dramatic closing scene here. That is the strange, quiet truth of it. No last shift filing out through the gates, no hooter sounding for the final time, no liquidator's van at the door. In 1974, Charlie Watkins simply wound Watkins Electric music down. He paid off the staff who had built the walls of sound. He sold the Offley Road factory. He shrank the whole operation to a small unit, a fraction of its former self. There was no bankruptcy. There was no receiver. There was no foreign corporation carrying the assets away in the night. A firm that had made the Rolling Stones audible to 250,000 people was closed by the deliberate, sober decision of the man who owned it, because he was tired and troubled and would rather be doing something else. The guitar side of the business passed quietly through other hands as Reg stepped back, through a man named Wilson, and then to Sid. The larger WEM, the company the industry and the public had known, held on in its diminished form through the rest of the decade. And then, in 1982, the Offley Road story ended for good, and WEM, as anyone had known it, closed its doors. But here is the thing the collapse chapter is supposed to deliver, and cannot, because it never happened. The Copicat did not die. While the festival era ended, while the wall of sound became a memory, the little turquoise box kept going. It went solid state into the Mark III and the Mark IV. It became an integrated circuit unit. It eventually went digital, reborn as the Copicat Gold. And Charlie himself, near the turn of the millennium, decades after he had supposedly been erased from the earth, made a fresh run of the original analog valve machines. The real thing, the genuine article with the old flaw still in it. And among the very first people to ring up and ask about them was David Gilmour of Pink Floyd. The man whose band had put WM speakers on an album cover in 1969 was still, 30 years on, wanting Charlie's echo. Turn the legend over and look at it now. The product, the story insists, was stolen and erased. The Copicat outlived the entire era of the men who supposedly stole it. It stayed in production, in one form or another, for more than half a century. It is one of the longest-lived designs in the history of the instrument. So what actually collapsed? Not the Copicat, not the man. What ended was the empire of noise, the festival rigs, the slave amp walls, the whole heroic, uneconomic one-man enterprise of making 500,000 people hear a guitar. That ended. But it ended the way a bonfire ends when the person tending it decides to go inside. Not because someone put it out, because he stopped feeding it, and Charlie Watkins, standing in the quiet of a sold factory, went back to the wire stripping machine he'd been designing, and to the instrument that had started everything, in a mess room, on a merchant ship, 35 years before. He did not stop inventing. He simply stopped being loud. Chapter 11. The name the world forgot. He got the rest of his life back, and he spent it well. In 1985, Charlie remarried, his wife June, who had been part of the story all along. And he did something that tells you he had been, at heart, the same man from the beginning to the end. He went back to the accordion, and he spent decades trying to make it better. He worked on accordion amplification. He developed MIDI accordion systems, marrying the instrument he had loved since 1938 to the very digital technology that had, supposedly, destroyed him. There was no bitterness in it. The man, who was meant to have been robbed of billions, spent his retirement happily soldering squeeze boxes in a South London front room. The industry did, eventually, remember him. In 2011, Charlie Watkins was given a Lifetime Achievement Award by Audio Pro International, a formal acknowledgement, late but real, from the world of live sound he had done so much to invent. He sat down and recorded an oral history for the NAMM archive, telling his own story in his own voice, the accordionist who accidentally built the modern stage. And on the 28th of October 2014, he died at home in Balham, the place where it had all begun, aged 91. What he left behind is scattered and precious and almost entirely unmarked. A clean valve Copicat now changes hands among collectors for around $1,000, a curio, a piece of history, hunted by people who understand what it was. A rare Watkins Joker amplifier can fetch thousands. The Arctic Monkeys, a full generation after the Wall of Sound, used a valve Copicat on a record in 2011, the old flaw still doing its work on a new century's music. And the original Isle of Wight PA, the actual columns and cabinets that carried Hendrix's last British notes out into that Solent wind, was tracked down and acquired by a private collector, Chris Hewitt, preserved and exhibited and documented in a book about the sound systems of those festivals. The Wall of Sound survives. It sits under exhibition lights now, silent, in a collection, a relic of the loudest noise Britain had ever made. So we come back to where we started, to the hillside and the 600,000 and the small, balding man behind the desk with the needles buried in the red. There is an industry now worth many billions of pounds. Live sound, touring rigs, festival production, the entire global business of making enormous crowds hear music clearly. It stands, in a real sense, on foundations that Charlie Watkins laid: the slave amplifier, the portable mixing desk, the stage monitor, the wall of speakers, the very idea that a field full of people could be made to hear a band. And that industry scarcely knows his name. The legend wants this to be an outrage. It wants a thief, a stolen patent, a fortune carried off to Tokyo. It wants Charlie Watkins to be a victim, because a victim is a simpler thing to mourn. But the truth is gentler and harder and more human than that. Nobody stole the empire. There were no billions to lose. WEM was 40 people and a factory off the Oval, and the man who ran it gave much of its value away on purpose because he cared more for the engineering than the money. He didn't fail to patent the Copicat out of naivety. He protected it with a secret instead, and it outlived everything built to replace it. And when the world he had made turned loud and violent and troubling to his conscience, he did not go down fighting. He set it down and walked home to the accordion, and was, by every account, content. A stranger in the street today would not know the name Watkins Electric Music, but show that same stranger the footage of the Stones in Hyde Park, or the vast slope of the Isle of Wight, or Hendrix on that final British stage asking for more, and they would know exactly what they were looking at. They would recognize the events. They would feel the scale. They simply wouldn't know that all of it, every watt, came from an accordionist from Balham who did it as an engineering challenge and then chose peace over the empire. That is not the story of a man destroyed by one mistake. It is the story of a man who made the modern world audible, took almost none of the credit or the money, and never much wanted either, and who is remembered now only in the sound of the crowds he taught to hear. Turn it up, Charlie. He did, louder than anyone, and then, when he'd had enough, he turned it off himself and went quietly home.